The Dog Who Saved 23 Children, a true story of heroism against all odds. What I'm about to tell you sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood movie, but every single word of this story is absolutely true. It's a story about intuition, about never giving up, and about how sometimes the most unlikely heroes come on four legs. This is the story of Rex, a German shepherd who single-handedly exposed one of the most horrifying child trafficking operations in small-town America, saving 23 innocent lives in the process. But before we dive into this incredible tale, I need you to understand something. This isn't just another feel-good animal story. This is a story about real evil, real darkness, and how one dog's unwavering determination became the light that pierced through it all. It's a story that will make you question everything you think you know about animal intelligence, about trust, and about the signs we miss every single day. So settle in, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after this video ends, and I guarantee you'll never look at a stray dog the same way again. Our story begins on a cold November afternoon in Mason Creek, Vermont. Picture this: a small town where everybody knows everybody, where the biggest crime is usually someone's teenager spray painting the water tower, or maybe a bar fight on Friday night. The kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and kids ride their bikes until the streetlights come on. Detective Mark Harris had been patrolling these quiet streets for nearly 15 years. At 42, he was the kind of cop who'd seen it all, or so he thought. He didn't scare easily, didn't jump to conclusions, and had developed that sixth sense that comes with years of reading people and situations. But on this particular day, something was different. Something was about to happen that would test every instinct he'd ever developed. Mark was sitting at a stop sign, probably thinking about his dinner plans, or maybe wondering if he'd catch the game later that night. Just another routine patrol in a town where routine was the norm. But then he saw something that made him pause. Across the street, in front of an old, weathered two-story house that looked like it had been abandoned since the Carter administration, sat a dog. Now, seeing a stray dog in a small town isn't unusual. Dogs wander, they get loose, they chase squirrels into neighboring yards. But this wasn't just any dog, and this wasn't just any ordinary moment of wandering. This was a large German shepherd with a sable coat that rippled in the cold November wind. And he wasn't wandering at all. He was sitting, perfectly still, staring at the front door of that old house with an intensity that made Mark's skin crawl. The house itself looked like something out of a horror movie, windows clouded with decades of grime, shingles curling and falling off the roof like dead skin, and a porch that sagged under the weight of years of neglect. The kind of place kids dare each other to spend the night in, the kind of place that generates ghost stories and urban legends. But the dog Mark would later name Rex, wasn't interested in ghost stories. He sat with his body perfectly rigid, ears pointed forward, amber eyes locked on that door, as if he were waiting for it to open. No sniffing around for interesting scents, no casual wandering, no typical dog behaviors at all. Just that unwavering, laser-focused stare. Mark rolled down his window. "Hey, buddy," he called out softly, the way you do when you're trying not to spook an animal. Rex didn't even blink, didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge Mark's presence in any way. His entire being was focused on that house, on that door, with a concentration that Mark had only seen in working dogs during the most serious operations. The light turned green, and Mark drove on. But something about that scene stuck with him. As a cop, you develop instincts about when something's not right, and every instinct Mark had was telling him that what he'd just witnessed wasn't normal dog behavior. This was focus. This was purpose. This was a dog who knew something. But what could he possibly know about an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere? The next day, Mark found himself taking the same route. Not because he had to, but because he couldn't shake the image of that dog from his mind. And sure enough, there was Rex again. Same spot. Same posture, same unwavering stare at the front door of that decrepit house. It was as if he hadn't moved a muscle in the past 24 hours. This time, Mark pulled over. He stepped out into the bite of the Vermont wind and really looked at the scene in front of him. The house seemed even more abandoned in the daylight. Paint peeled off the siding like sunburned skin. The yard was choked with weeds that had gone to seed months ago, and one of the shutters hung by a single hinge, banging weakly against the wall whenever the wind caught it. "Where's your owner, pal?" Mark asked, scanning the street for any sign of human life. No leash, no collar, no one calling for a lost pet. Rex's head turned slightly at the sound of Mark's voice, acknowledgement that he'd heard, but then his gaze snapped right back to the house. Mark walked a few steps closer, and Rex tensed, not in fear, but in warning. It was the kind of body language that said, "Don't mess this up. This is important." For a moment, Mark had the strangest feeling that the dog knew something he didn't. Something crucial that he was trying to communicate in the only way he could. 2 more days passed, and Mark caught himself doing something he'd never done before in 15 years of police work, timing his patrol specifically to check on a dog. But there was Rex, every single day, maintaining his vigil like a soldier on duty. Rain or shine, morning or afternoon, whenever Mark drove by that corner, Rex was there, always in the exact same spot, always with that same intense focus. By the 4th day, the weather had turned nasty. Cold rain swept through Mason Creek, the kind of sideways rain that cuts right through your clothes and chills you to the bone. Mark figured there was no way Rex would be out in weather like this, but as he drove past, his wipers struggling against the downpour, there he was, soaked to the skin, shivering, but absolutely refusing to abandon his post. That did it for Mark. He parked across the street, left his engine running, and stepped out into the rain. "You're going to freeze out here, boy," he said, crouching down low so he wouldn't seem threatening. Rex's amber eyes met his for the first time in days, and he gave a soft, low whine. Then, almost as if he were trying to explain something, he looked back at the house. Mark followed his gaze once more. In the grey, rain-soaked afternoon, the house looked even more foreboding. The porch sagged under the weight of accumulated moisture, the gutters overflowed with years of debris, and the whole structure seemed to lean slightly to one side, as if it were tired of standing upright. But something about Rex's behavior, something about the way he kept returning to this spot day after day, rain or shine, was setting off every alarm bell in Mark's head. In 15 years of police work, he'd learned to trust 2 things above all else: his own instincts and the instincts of a good dog. Right now, both were telling him that something wasn't right about this picture. That evening, Mark brought up the situation at the precinct. Most of the officers chuckled about the haunted house mutt, but Sergeant Coleman, a 30-year veteran who'd seen everything there was to see in small-town policing, leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful frown. "That property's been a ghost for decades," Coleman said, stroking his graying beard. "Code enforcement's been after it forever, but the owner's MIA. Last we heard, it belonged to some shell company out of state. You thinking there's something inside worth investigating?" Mark chose his words carefully. "I'm thinking my gut's telling me it's not nothing, and I've never seen a dog behave like this one. He's not just hanging around, he's watching, waiting, like he knows something we don't." Coleman shrugged. "You want to dig into it? File for a search warrant. You know the drill." Mark knew the drill all right. He also knew that getting a search warrant for an Abandoned house based on the behavior of a stray dog wasn't exactly textbook police work. It would take time, paperwork, and convincing a judge that there was probable cause to believe a crime was being committed. Time that might be precious if Rex was trying to tell them something urgent. 2 mornings later, Mason Creek woke up to a brittle frost that turned every tree branch into crystal and made the world look like it was made of glass. When Mark swung by the house for his now daily check, Rex wasn't in his usual spot on the curb. Instead, he was at the rusted gate that led to the front walkway, his front paws planted firmly on the ground, tail rigid, a deep growl rumbling in his chest that Mark could hear from across the street. Mark got out of his cruiser slowly, every sense on high alert. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. Rex barked once, sharp, urgent, commanding, then trotted up the cracked concrete path toward the front porch. He stopped at the front door and began, pawing at it, his nails clicking against the rotted wood in a rhythm that was anything but random. This wasn't the restless scratching of a bored dog looking for attention. This was deliberate, purposeful, almost like he was trying to knock, like he was announcing his presence to someone inside. Mark stood at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at this dog who had apparently appointed himself as some kind of canine detective, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. Everything about this situation was wrong. Dogs didn't behave like this without a reason. Working dogs, police dogs, search and rescue dogs. They acted with this kind of focus when they'd found what they were looking for. But what could Rex have possibly found at an abandoned house that had been empty for decades? Back in his cruiser, Mark typed out a message to Sergeant Coleman. "Need warrant for 119 Oak Street. Possible K9 alert to suspicious activity." He hit send before he could talk himself out of it, knowing that he was about to explain to his superior officer why he wanted to search a house based on the testimony of a dog he'd never actually met. While he waited for the warrant to come through, Mark did some research of his own. He pulled county records, searched old newspaper archives, and dug into the property's history. What he found wasn't exactly shocking, but it was definitely suspicious. The property had been sitting empty for years, with tax bills going unpaid and mounting up. The last registered owner was a shell company incorporated in Delaware with an address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service. In Mark's experience, shell companies and mail forwarding services weren't typically used by people who had nothing to hide. Still, without a warrant, all he could do was watch, and Rex made sure he kept watching. Every single day, rain or shine, the German Shepherd maintained his vigil. If anything, his behavior was becoming more urgent, more insistent. He'd pace back and forth in front of the gate, whine softly when Mark drove by, and always return to that spot by the front door where he'd scratch and paw as if he were trying to dig his way inside. One night, driving home after a particularly long shift, Mark decided to swing by Oak Street one more time. His headlights swept across the front of the house, and for just a moment, he could have sworn he saw movement behind one of the upstairs windows. Just a flicker, a shadow shifting. Where no shadow should be, then nothing. He hit the brakes and rolled down his window. The street was completely silent except for the ticking of his cooling engine. Then, from the shadows near the gate, 2 amber eyes reflected his headlights. Rex stepped into the light, and even in the darkness, Mark could see that the dog was soaked from the evening mist. Rex looked directly at him and barked once. It was the kind of bark that left no room for interpretation, the kind of bark that said, "Pay attention, this matters." The warrant came through 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning that dawned clear and cold. When Mark parked in front of 119 Oak Street, 2 patrol cars were already there, and Officer Vega was waiting by the front gate with a pry bar and bolt cutters. Rex was there too, of course, sitting patiently as if he'd been expecting them. When he saw Mark get out of the cruiser, his tail began to wag. not with excitement, but with something that looked almost like relief. Like he was saying, "Finally, let me show you what I've been trying to tell you. Let's see what you've been watching all this time, partner," Mark said softly, and Rex's ears perked up at the word partner, as if he understood that they were now officially working together. The lock on the front door was so old and corroded that it gave way with just a twist of the pry bar. As the door swung open, a rush of stale, cold air flowed out, carrying with it the smell of mildew, dust, and something else. Something that made Mark's nose wrinkle and his instincts flare. The interior of the house was exactly what you'd expect from a building that had been abandoned for decades. The living room was completely bare, no furniture, no personal belongings, nothing but peeling wallpaper and water stains on the ceiling. The floorboards creaked ominously under their boots as they stepped inside, and dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that filtered through the grimy windows. "Clear," Officer Vega called from the kitchen after a quick sweep. But Rex wasn't interested in the kitchen or the living room or any of the obvious spaces. He had already slipped into the hallway, his nose low to the floor, following some scent trail that was invisible to human senses. He stopped in front of what looked like an ordinary closet door and began pawing at it with the same deliberate intensity Mark had seen him display at the front door. Mark tried the knob. Locked. "Get me the crowbar," he called to Vega. With a grunt of effort, Mark forced the door open, and instead of the shelves and hanging clothes you'd expect to find in a closet, they were looking at a set of narrow wooden stairs that disappeared down into absolute darkness. The air that flowed up from below was noticeably colder than the rest of the house, and it carried that same strange smell, but stronger now. Mark clicked on his flashlight and aimed the beam down the stairs. The light revealed rough wooden walls, a low ceiling, and what appeared to be a concrete floor at the bottom. Rex didn't hesitate. He started down the stairs with confident steps, as if he'd been planning this moment for weeks. Mark followed, ducking his head to avoid the low ceiling, with Vega close behind. The basement was larger than Mark had expected, stretching beyond the footprint of the house above. The walls were damp concrete, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else that Mark couldn't quite identify, but that made his stomach clench with unease. Rex padded across the concrete floor and stopped at another door, this one made of metal and secured with a heavy bolt on the outside. His entire body was rigid with focus, his tail straight out behind him, his ears pricked forward. This was the posture of a dog who had found exactly what he was looking for. Mark placed his hand on the bolt. It was stiff with age and moisture, but it gave way under pressure. The metal door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the basement like a warning, revealing another room beyond. This room was different. It was smaller, maybe 10 feet by 12, and it wasn't empty. There was a rusted metal cot against one wall, a few broken chairs scattered around, and metal trays stacked in the corners. But what caught Mark's attention immediately was the dust pattern on the floor. While everything else in the room was covered with a thick layer of undisturbed dust, there was a clear path from the door to the cot, and the seat of one of the chairs had been polished smooth, as if someone had been sitting in it recently. "Someone's been down here," Vega said quietly, stating the obvious but somehow making it sound more ominous. Rex was already moving toward the far wall, sniffing along the baseboards. Mark followed him with the flashlight beam and saw what the dog had found. A thin line scored into the dust, curving toward the wall, as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor and leaned against it. Mark pressed against the wall where the line ended. Instead of solid concrete, the wall flexed slightly under his hand. "This isn't a foundation wall," he told Vega. "It's been put up to hide something." They spent the next 20 minutes systematically searching every inch of the basement. Most of it looked like standard abandoned building decay. Rusted shelves, broken tools, paint cans with contents that had long since solidified. But the layout didn't make sense. The rooms they'd found so far didn't match the footprint of the house above them. Somewhere down here, there was more space than there should be. And Rex was the one who found it. He led them to a corner of the basement where an old, disconnected water heater stood silent and cold. The floor behind it was covered with sheets of plywood that looked newer than anything else in the basement. Rex sniffed around the edges of the plywood, pawed once, and then sat back and looked at Mark with an expression that clearly said, "Here, this is what you need to see." Mark and Vega dragged the water heater aside, revealing that the plywood was covering what appeared to be a trapdoor cut directly into the concrete floor. There was no handle, just a rough opening that had been covered over. "You've got to be kidding me," Vega muttered, but he was already reaching for the crowbar. They pried the plywood up, and immediately a rush of air flowed up from below, air that was warmer than the basement and that carried a smell that made both officers step back instinctively. It wasn't just mildew anymore. There was something organic about it, something that spoke of human occupancy. Mark angled his flashlight down through the opening. The beam revealed narrow wooden steps descending into what looked like a hand-dug tunnel. The steps were worn smooth on the edges, polished by repeated use. "You armed?" Mark asked Vega quietly. Vega patted his service weapon. "Always." Mark looked down at Rex, who was sitting patiently, beside the opening, his amber eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. "Stay close, buddy. We don't know what we're going to find down there." The stairs were steep and narrow, forcing them to descend single file. The walls on either side weren't concrete. They were packed earth, shored up with wooden beams that looked like they'd been salvaged from construction sites. The air grew warmer as they went deeper, and the smell grew stronger. At the bottom of the steps, Mark's flashlight revealed a hallway carved directly into the earth. The ceiling was low enough that he had to duck, and the floor was dirt that had been packed hard by foot traffic. Lots of foot traffic, over a long period of time. Rex moved ahead, his nose working constantly. About 20 feet down the hallway, he stopped at another door, this one made of thick wood and secured with a heavy bolt on the outside. The kind of bolt you use when you want to make absolutely sure that whatever's on the other side can't get out. Mark's hands were steady as he slid the bolt free, but his heart was pounding. In 15 years of police work, he'd served plenty of warrants, searched plenty of buildings, found plenty of things that people wanted to keep hidden. But something about this felt different. Something about the careful construction, the multiple layers of security, the way Rex had known exactly where to lead them. It all pointed to something much more serious than drug dealing or stolen property. The door swung, open to reveal yet another room, this one larger than the others. Mark swept his flashlight beam across the space and immediately saw shapes in the corners that made his breath catch in his throat. Small shapes, bundles of fabric, objects that were clearly meant for human use, but human use by very small humans. Rex moved forward into the room, his tail low, his posture careful and non-threatening. He went directly to the far wall, where another door waited. This one was smaller, plainer, and, unlike all the others, it wasn't locked. From somewhere beyond that door came a sound that made every hair on Mark's arm stand on end. It was quiet, barely audible, but unmistakably human. The sound of someone breathing, someone trying very hard to be quiet, someone who was awake and listening and afraid. "Vega," Mark said quietly, "we need backup. Now." But even as Vega reached for his radio, Mark was moving toward that final door. Because whatever was on the other side had been waiting long. Enough. Whatever Rex had been trying to show them, whatever he'd been guarding and watching and refusing to abandon, it was right here, right now, on the other side of this last barrier. Mark reached for the handle, Rex standing tense and ready beside him, and pushed the door open. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness and revealed what would stay burned in his memory for the rest of his life. In the corner of the small room, pressed back against the wall, was a child, maybe 8 years old, thin and dirty, with tangled hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. The child's eyes were wide with terror, but when Rex stepped carefully into the room and lowered himself to the ground in the universal dog gesture of peaceful intentions, something in those frightened eyes shifted slightly. "Hey there," Mark said as gently as he could manage, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Mark. I'm a police officer. You're safe now." For a long moment, the child didn't move or speak. Then, in a voice so quiet Mark had to strain to hear it, came the words that would change everything. "There's more." "More what?" Mark asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "More kids." And that's when Mark realized that what Rex had found, what he'd been guarding and trying to show them for all those days and nights, wasn't just one missing child. It was something much bigger, much more horrible and much more urgent than he'd ever imagined. As Vega called for backup and paramedics, as more officers arrived and began the careful process of searching every inch of the underground complex, as social workers and child psychologists were summoned to help with what was clearly going to be a massive rescue operation, Mark stayed with that first child and with Rex. And as the night wore on, as door after door was opened and room after room was searched, the count kept climbing. 3 children, 7, 11, 15, 20. By dawn, 23. Children had been brought up from the underground chambers beneath that abandoned house in Mason Creek, Vermont. 23 children who had been hidden away from the world, kept in conditions that no human being should ever have to endure, and who might have remained hidden forever if not for one German shepherd who refused to look away. The man they arrested that night, caught trying to escape through a tunnel that led to an exit nearly a block away from the house, was charged with 23 counts of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and child abuse. The investigation that followed would reveal a trafficking operation that had been running for years, using the abandoned house as a way station for children who were being moved from place to place, sold like property to the highest bidder. But all of that, the trials, the convictions, the lengthy sentences, the national media attention that would eventually descend on Mason Creek, all of that came later. In the Isaac moment in those first few hours after the rescue, what mattered was simpler and more immediate. 23 children who had seen nothing but darkness for weeks or months were suddenly breathing fresh air. They were wrapped in warm blankets, given food and water, examined by doctors who treated them with infinite gentleness. They were surrounded by police officers and paramedics and social workers who spoke to them in soft voices and promised them over and over that they were safe now, that no one would ever hurt them again. And through it all, Rex moved among them like some kind of therapy dog, allowing the children to pet him, to bury their faces in his fur, to hold on to him as if he were an anchor in a world that had suddenly become bright and loud and overwhelming after so much darkness and silence. Mark watched it all with a mixture of relief, rage, and something that felt almost like reverence. Relief that they'd found the children in time. Rage at what had been done to them, and reverence for the intelligence, the persistence, the sheer moral courage of one dog who had seen something wrong and had refused to give up until someone listened. Over the following days and weeks, as the investigation continued and the full scope of what had been happening became clear, people kept asking Mark the same question. How did you know? How did you figure out that there were children hidden in that house? And every time, Mark gave the same answer. I didn't figure it out. Rex did. He knew from the very beginning. All I did was finally start listening to what he was trying to tell me. The story made national news, of course. Television crews descended on Mason Creek, reporters interviewed everyone involved, and Rex became something of a celebrity. There were photo shoots and interviews and offers for book deals and movie rights, but for Mark, the real story wasn't about fame or recognition. The real story was about trust. Trust between species. Trust in instincts that you can't explain logically. Trust in the idea that sometimes the most important voices are the ones that can't speak in words. Rex never did find his original owner, if he ever had one. Instead, he found something better. A purpose, a partner, and a home with Mark, who officially adopted him and brought him onto the Mason Creek police force as their first K-9 officer. The two of them went on to work together for years, solving cases and helping people throughout Vermont and beyond. Rex proved to be naturally gifted at search and rescue work, drug detection, and tracking suspects, but he never again showed the kind of focused, obsessive behavior that had led to the discovery at 119 Oak Street. It was as if that one case had been his calling, his destiny, the reason he'd been put on this earth. Once he'd completed that mission, once all 23 children were safe, he was able to relax and be a normal working dog. The children themselves, remarkably, all survived their ordeal. They were placed with loving families, received therapy and medical care, and slowly began to rebuild their lives. Many of them kept in touch with Mark over the years, sending letters and photos, visiting when they could. And all of them remembered Rex. In their letters, in their visits, in their conversations with therapists and social workers, they talked about the dog who had found them, who had somehow known they were there when no one else did. Some of them said they'd dreamed about a dog coming to rescue them. Others said they'd heard barking in the distance and knew somehow that help was on the way. All of them, in their own way, understood that Rex had been more than just a pet who happened to be in the right place at the right time. He had been their guardian angel, their protector, their voice when they had no voice of their own. The house at 119 Oak Street was eventually demolished, and the city of Mason Creek turned the lot into a small park. They installed a plaque commemorating the courage of the 23 children who survived their imprisonment there, and honoring the loyalty and intelligence of the dog whose persistence had led to their rescue. Every year, on the anniversary of the rescue, the survivors who are able to make the trip gather in that park. They bring their families, their children, their new lives built on the foundation of their survival, and they tell the story of Rex to anyone who will listen. But perhaps the most important legacy of that November night in Mason Creek isn't the plaque, or the news stories, or the commendations. It's something simpler and more profound. The reminder that heroism comes in many forms, that intelligence and empathy exist throughout the animal kingdom, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is pay attention to what our four-legged friends are trying to tell us. In a world that often feels dark and dangerous, where terrible things happen to innocent people, and where evil sometimes seems to triumph, the story of Rex offers something precious: hope. Hope that there are guardian angels watching over us, even in forms we might not expect. Hope that persistence and courage can overcome even the most carefully constructed evil. And hope that love, whether it comes from another human being or from a loyal dog who refuses to give up, can literally save lives. Mark Harris retired from police work several years ago, but he and Rex continued to visit schools and community centers, sharing their story and teaching children about safety, about trusting their instincts, and about the special bond between humans and animals. Rex lived to be 13 years old, spending his final years as a beloved family pet and occasional therapy dog. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the people who loved him, the entire town of Mason Creek mourned. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including many of the children he had saved, now grown into adults with families of their own. They buried him in the small park that had been built on the site of 119 Oak Street, beneath an oak tree that had been planted in his honor. The inscription on his headstone reads simply, "Rex. He never stopped believing they were worth saving." And that perhaps is the most important lesson of this entire story. In a world where it's easy to become cynical, where it's tempting to look the other way when something doesn't seem quite right, where it's simpler to assume that someone else will take care of problems that don't directly affect us, Rex showed us a different way. He showed us what it looks like to care deeply about strangers, to persist in the face of indifference, to trust our instincts even when we can't explain them logically, to refuse to give up on people who have been forgotten by everyone else. He showed us what it means to be a hero, and he did it all without saying a single word. So the next time you see a stray dog, the next time an animal behaves in a way that seems unusual or persistent, the next time your own instincts tell you that something isn't quite right about a situation, remember Rex. Remember that sometimes the most important messages come from the most unexpected messengers. Remember that heroism isn't always loud and obvious. Sometimes it's quiet and patient. Sometimes it's as simple as refusing to walk away. Sometimes it's as profound as a dog who sits in the rain for days because he knows that somewhere in the darkness, children are waiting to be found. And remember that all of us have the power to be heroes in our own way, to pay attention to what others might miss, to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, to persist when others would give up. Because in the end, that's what Rex taught us. Not that dogs are smarter than we thought, though they clearly are. Not that law enforcement needs more canine units, though they clearly do. But that all of us, human and animal alike, have the capacity to make a difference in the world, one act of courage at a time. The story of Rex and the 23 children he saved will be told for generations to come. It will be told as a reminder that hope exists even in the darkest places, that love can triumph over evil, that intelligence and courage come in many forms, and that sometimes the most important voice in the room is the one that doesn't speak with words. It will be told as a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of trusting our instincts, and the incredible bond between humans and the animals who choose to love and protect us. But most of all, it will be told as proof that heroes walk among us every day, often in forms we don't expect, waiting for us to be brave enough to listen to what they're trying to tell us. Rex's story ended the way all the best hero stories do. Not with fame or recognition, but with lives saved, families reunited, and a reminder that love is stronger than evil, that courage can overcome fear, and that sometimes all it takes to change the world is one individual who refuses to give up. In Mason Creek, Vermont, they still talk about the dog who sat in the rain, the dog who wouldn't walk away, the dog who saved 23 children and reminded an entire town what it means to never stop caring about people who need our help. They tell his story to their children and their grandchildren. They tell it as a reminder that heroism is real, that miracles happen, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is pay attention to what our four-legged friends are trying to tell us. And in a world that often feels dark and dangerous, that story offers something precious, the reminder that there are guardian angels watching over us, often in forms we would never expect, and that love, in all its many forms, has the power to save us all.